February 9th, 1961. The Beatles were 3 songs into their Cavern Club set when the ceiling began cracking above the crowd. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? The limestone dust fell first, barely visible in the dim underground lights. Paul noticed it landing on his bass, mixing with the condensation from 300 bodies, packed into a space meant for 150. The Cavern Club's famous arched ceiling, carved from Liverpool's ancient bedrock, had survived German bombing raids in World War II, but it couldn't survive Beatlemania. John felt the vibration through his feet before anyone heard the sound, a deep, grinding crack that cut through Love Me Do like a knife. George grabbed Paul's arm. Ringo stood up from his kit. The crowd, still swaying, hadn't noticed yet. The Beatles had exactly 45 seconds to make a decision that would either save lives or end their career before it truly began. What John shouted next into that microphone: "Everyone get back. Get back now." His voice, usually dripping with sarcasm and wit, carried a terror that froze the dancing crowd. In the history of the Cavern Club, no band had ever stopped mid-song. The rules were simple. You played your set, no matter what. Equipment could fail, fights could break out, people could faint from the heat, but the music never stopped. That was the code. But John Lennon had just broken it, and 300 confused faces turned toward the stage. Paul saw the second crack form, a black lightning bolt spreading across the white limestone arch directly above the center of the crowd. The ceiling was 300 years old, carved by merchants who'd used these tunnels to store cotton and rum from the slave trade. The Beatles had played here 18 times already, but tonight was different. Tonight word had spread. Tonight for the first time they weren't just another Mersey beat band. Tonight people had come specifically to see the Beatles, and the club was packed beyond any safe capacity. The owner, Ray McFall, stood at the back counting money, unaware that his underground kingdom was about to collapse. The doorman, a mountain of a man named Tommy Fitzgerald, had let in 50 more people than he should have, pocketing the extra admission fees. Those 50 extra bodies, dancing and jumping in unison to the Mersey beat, had created a resonance that the ancient ceiling couldn't withstand. But here's the part that nobody talks about. There was a girl in the front row, pressed against the stage. Her name was Sarah Blackwood, 17 years old, and she'd been following the Beatles since their first Cavern performance. She wasn't screaming like the others. She was sketching. In a small notebook, she'd been drawing John's face, trying to capture something she saw in his eyes. A hunger, an ambition that seemed too big for this underground tomb. When John shouted his warning, Sarah looked up from her sketch and saw what the band saw: a ceiling about to become a tomb. George Harrison, only 17 himself, made the first move. He unplugged his guitar and jumped off the 3-foot stage directly into the crowd. "Move back." Everyone moved back toward the walls. His voice was high, panicked, but it carried authority. The crowd, confused but beginning to sense real danger, started shuffling backward. But in a space so packed that people could barely breathe, let alone move, the retreat was agonizingly slow. Ringo, who wasn't even officially in the band yet, just filling in for Pete Best, who was sick, abandoned his drums and started physically pushing people toward the walls. His hands were bleeding from a rim shot gone wrong earlier in the set, leaving bloody handprints on the white shirts and dresses of terrified teenagers. Later, those stains would become badges of honor, proof they'd been there the night the Beatles saved lives. Paul McCartney did something that would define his entire career. He kept playing, even as chaos erupted. Even as the ceiling began to rain larger chunks of limestone, Paul played a bass line. Simple, repetitive, hypnotic. It gave the crowd something to focus on, besides their fear. Music as crowd control, music as salvation. Stop. What happened in the next 30 seconds changed rock history forever. The main crack suddenly exploded into a spider web of fractures. A chunk of ceiling the size of a dinner table broke free and hung for a moment, suspended by nothing but century-old mortar and prayer. John saw it first. It was directly above Sarah Blackwood, the girl with the sketch pad. Without thinking, without considering that he was about to potentially end his life at 20 years old, John Lennon dove off the stage. The impact knocked Sarah backward, just as the limestone crashed where she'd been standing. The sound was deafening, like a bomb going off in a phone booth. Dust exploded through the club, turning the air into a choking white fog. The single light bulb illuminating the stage shattered, plunging half the club into darkness. Screams erupted, not fan screams, but terror screams, the kind that come from the primal part of the brain that knows death is near. In the darkness and dust, John found himself on top of Sarah Blackwood, his body shielding hers from the falling debris. He could taste blood in his mouth. He'd bitten through his tongue on impact. Sarah's notebook was pressed between them, her sketch of John now smeared with dust and sweat and fear. She was crying, her body shaking uncontrollably. John held her tighter, whispering words he'd later claim he couldn't remember. "It's all right, love, I've got you. The Beatles've got you." George had managed to clear a path to the emergency exit, a narrow stairway that led up to Matthew Street. But in the panic, people were pushing, shoving, climbing over each other. He saw a boy go down, trampled, and dove in to pull him up. The boy's name was Michael Davies, and 40 years later, he'd name his son George in honor of the Beatle who saved his life. But the most shocking part was yet to come. Paul's baseline had done its job. It had prevented a total stampede. People were moving toward the exits in something resembling order, but Paul could see they weren't moving fast enough. The entire center section of the ceiling was now cracked, held up by physics and luck, both of which were running out. He made a decision that would haunt him for years. He started singing, not Love Me Do or any of their regular songs. Paul McCartney started singing Amazing Grace. His voice, clear and strong despite the chaos, cut through the screams and dust. One by one, people stopped pushing and started singing along. 300 voices convinced they were about to die, singing a hymn in an underground club that reeked of beer and sweat and rock and roll. Ringo had found Ray McFall, the owner, frozen in shock at the back of the club, still clutching his money box. "We need to get everyone out now," Ringo screamed. McFall just stared at the ceiling, watching his livelihood literally crumbling. Ringo slapped him hard. "Your club is gone, mate. But these people don't have to be." Something in McFall's eyes clicked back to reality. He ran to the main exit and started pulling people through, his expensive suit tearing on the rough walls. Tommy Fitzgerald, the doorman, whose greed had contributed to the overcrowding, redeemed himself in those moments. He picked up 2 teenage girls who'd fainted and carried them out like a father carrying sleeping children. He went back 3 more times, each time emerging with someone else who couldn't make it on their own. On his 4th trip back, a massive section of ceiling came down, sealing the entrance. Tommy was still inside. This detail changes everything about what really happened. John and Sarah were trapped in the front section of the club, cut off from the exits by the fallen ceiling. They could hear Paul still singing, his voice getting fainter as people evacuated. John looked around desperately. The stage was 3 feet high, made of solid wood. If more ceiling came down, it might provide some protection. He grabbed Sarah's hand. Under the stage. Now. They crawled under just as another massive crack split the air. This time, it wasn't just limestone falling, it was everything. Wooden support beams, installed in the 1800s, came crashing down. Iron brackets, rusted with age, broke free and fell like medieval weapons. The famous Cavern Club, birthplace of the Mersey sound, was eating itself alive. Under the stage, in complete darkness, John and Sarah could hear the world ending above them. John felt something wet on his face and realized Sarah was bleeding from a gash on her forehead. He ripped off his shirt, the same leather shirt that would later become part of the Beatles' iconic Hamburg look, and pressed it against her wound. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Think about your sketches. Tell me about your sketches." Sarah's voice was weak but determined. "I draw faces, but not just faces. I draw what's behind them. You've got ambition that could burn down the world. John Lennon. I can see it. It's beautiful and terrifying." John laughed, a bitter sound in the darkness. "Well, it might burn down this club first. You haven't heard the most incredible part yet." Outside, Paul, George and Ringo stood on Matthew Street, surrounded by evacuated clubgoers, many crying, some injured, all in shock. The entrance to the cavern was completely blocked by fallen debris. They could hear sirens approaching. Someone had called the fire brigade, but Paul knew they wouldn't be fast enough. "John's still in there," he said, his voice hollow. George was already moving. "There's another way. The old smuggler's tunnel. It connects to the wine cellar next door." It was a legend among Liverpool musicians, a secret tunnel dating back to the slave trade days. George had explored it once when he was 15, on a dare. It was barely 2 feet wide, partially flooded, and probably led nowhere, but it was a chance. Without hesitation, Paul and George ran to the building next door, Ringo close behind. The owner, an elderly man named William Cross, was standing outside, watching the commotion. "We need to get into your cellar," Paul said. "Now, our mate's trapped." Cross didn't ask questions. He led them down narrow stairs, into a cellar that smelled of centuries-old wine and rot. George found the tunnel entrance behind a stack of wooden crates. It was smaller than he remembered, barely large enough for a child, let alone 3 grown men. Water was seeping from the walls, and the sound of the collapsing cavern echoed through like the earth itself was screaming. George went first on his belly, pushing through water and mud and things he didn't want to identify. The tunnel was a nightmare. Every few feet, George had to stop and clear away debris, broken bottles, dead rats, the detritus of centuries. Behind him, Paul was struggling. His bass player hands, trained for precision and delicacy, were being shredded by the rough stone walls. Ringo, bringing up the rear, was fighting claustrophobia, his drummer's breathing exercises, the only thing keeping him from total panic. Here's what the official records never mention. In the darkness under the cavern stage, John heard something that shouldn't have been possible. His name being called from below, not from above, where the ceiling continued its slow-motion collapse, but from below the stage itself. The voice was muffled, distorted, but unmistakably George Harrison's. "John, John, you bastard. Answer me." John pressed his ear to the floor. There was a hollow sound, and then he remembered. The stage was built over an old drain grate, part of Liverpool's ancient sewer system. Most of it had been sealed off decades ago, but parts still connected to other tunnels. "George, we're here, under the stage." What followed was an engineering miracle, performed by 3 musicians who barely knew how to change their own guitar strings. Using broken mic stands as levers and pieces of fallen ceiling as hammers, they broke through the drain grate from below. The opening was tiny, maybe 18 inches across, but it was enough. Sarah went first, John literally forcing her through the hole despite her protests. George's hands caught her, pulling her into the flooded tunnel below. She screamed as the cold water hit her, but she was alive. John went to follow but stopped. Above him, through the gaps in the stage boards, he could see something that made his blood run cold. Tommy Fitzgerald, the doorman, was still alive, trapped under a beam near what used to be the bar. His leg clearly broken, maybe dying. John could leave now, escape through the tunnel, live to become the John Lennon the world would know. Or he could try to save a man who'd contributed to this disaster through his greed. This is the moment that defined who John Lennon really was. "Get Sarah out," John yelled down to George. "I'll be right behind you." It was a lie, and they all knew it. Paul's voice came through the hole. Desperate. "John, don't be a hero. Not now." But John was already crawling out from under the stage, back into the death trap that the cavern had become. The journey to Tommy took less than a minute, but felt like hours. John dodged falling chunks of ceiling. His bare torso, he'd given his shirt to Sarah, for her wound being pelted with debris. When he reached Tommy, the big man was barely conscious, his face gray with shock and pain. "Leave me," Tommy whispered. "I did this. Too many people. My fault." John Lennon, who would later become famous for his cutting wit and cruel honesty, said the kindest lie of his life. "Wasn't your fault, mate. Building's just old. Now shut up and help me get you out of here." Using strength that came from pure adrenaline, John managed to lift the beam enough for Tommy to pull his leg free. The leg was definitely broken, bent at an impossible angle, but Tommy was alive. John half carried, half dragged him back toward the stage, chunks of ceiling crashing around them like artillery fire. They made it to the hole, just as the main support beam, a massive oak timber that had held up the cavern's ceiling since the 1800s, finally gave way. But wait, there's something nobody knows about what happened next. John pushed Tommy through the hole first, hearing Paul and George catch him below. Then, just as John was about to follow, the entire stage collapsed. 300 pounds of wood and iron came crashing down, sealing the hole, trapping John Lennon in a space no bigger than a coffin. The air was full of dust, making breathing almost impossible. Above him, he could hear the final death throes of the Cavern Club. Below him, his bandmates were screaming his name. John Lennon, age 20, future leader of the biggest band in history, closed his eyes and did something he hadn't done since his mother died. He prayed, not to God, exactly, but to the music itself, to the spirit of rock and roll that had brought him to this underground tomb. He prayed that if he died here, someone would remember that the Beatles had tried to save lives, that they'd been more than just another band looking for fame. Then he heard it. Paul's bass. Paul was playing again. The sound traveling through the water in the tunnel below, vibrating through the wood of the collapsed stage. It was "That'll Be the Day" by Buddy Holly, the first song John and Paul had ever played together 3 years earlier. It was Paul saying goodbye, but also saying, "Remember why we started this." The sound gave John an idea. The stage hadn't collapsed evenly. One corner was still raised, creating a small gap. If he could push through the debris, if he could make it to that corner, John started digging with his bare hands, his fingers soon bloody, his nails torn off. He pushed through splintered wood that tore his chest, through rusted nails that punctured his palms. Every inch was agony, but Paul's bass kept playing, giving him something to move toward. The truth about how John escaped will give you chills. After what felt like hours, but was actually less than 5 minutes, John's hand broke through to open air. He could see light. Not much, just a faint glow from a street lamp filtering through the collapsed entrance. He pushed harder, widening the gap, and suddenly hands were grabbing him, pulling him through. Not Paul or George or Ringo. They were still in the tunnel with Sarah and Tommy. But other hands. The crowd that had evacuated had come back, forming a human chain to pull out anyone who might still be alive. The person who pulled John out was Sarah Blackwood's father, Arthur. He'd arrived at the club to pick up his daughter, only to find it collapsing. He'd been part of the rescue chain for 20 minutes, pulling out stranger after stranger, not knowing if his daughter was alive or dead. When he pulled John through, and saw the blood-soaked shirt wrapped around John's torso, Sarah's blood from her head wound, he nearly killed John right there, thinking he'd hurt her. "She's safe," John gasped. "In the tunnel. Your Sarah's safe." Arthur Blackwood held John Lennon then, this leather-clad rocker who represented everything parents feared about the new music, and sobbed with relief. Around them, the Cavern Club continued its death rattle, but people were alive. 300 had gone in. 300 came out. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the evacuation was complete. Paul, George, and Ringo had emerged from William Cross's cellar, covered in sewage and mud but triumphant, with Sarah and Tommy in tow. The reunion of the Beatles on Matthew Street, all four of them bloodied and filthy and alive, was captured by a single photographer from the Liverpool Echo. The photo would later become one of the most famous images in rock history, four young men who'd chosen to risk everything to save strangers. But here's what changed. The Beatles forever. The Cavern Club was destroyed. It would be rebuilt, but the original, the authentic basement where the Beatles cut their teeth, was gone. Ray McFall lost everything. He'd had no insurance. Who insures an underground club? He was ruined. The next morning, John, Paul, George, and Pete Best, Ringo was just sitting in, remember, met at Paul's house. They had a decision to make. They had £17 between them, their payment for the show that never finished, plus tips. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. They could keep it, use it to get to their next gig in Manchester. Or John pulled out a piece of paper. It was Sarah's sketch, the one she'd been drawing when the ceiling started to fall. Despite everything, it had survived, showing John on stage, his face full of that hungry ambition Sarah had talked about. "We give it to McFall," John said simply. "All of it. It won't rebuild the club, but it's something." Paul nodded. George agreed immediately. Pete, who would soon be replaced by Ringo permanently, said yes. Four boys who had nothing, gave everything to help a man whose greed had nearly killed them all. When they handed Ray McFall the money, along with a promise to play for free when he rebuilt, the tough Liverpool club owner broke down crying. The aftermath revealed something extraordinary. The investigation into the collapse revealed that the Cavern Club had been doomed for months. The limestone ceiling had been slowly eroding due to water damage from a broken pipe in the building above. The crowd that night had simply been the final straw. If the Beatles hadn't noticed the ceiling cracking, if John hadn't stopped the show, the entire ceiling would have come down at once. The death toll would have been catastrophic, possibly all 300 people. The Beatles hadn't just saved a few lives. They'd prevented one of the worst disasters in British entertainment history. Sarah Blackwood's sketch survived, and now hangs in the Liverpool Museum. She never sold it, despite offers that would have made her rich. She became an art teacher, and every year on February 9th, she tells her students about the night the Beatles saved her life. Art is about capturing truth, she says. That sketch captured John's ambition, but what happened that night captured his soul. Tommy Fitzgerald, the doorman whose greed contributed to the overcrowding, never fully recovered from his injuries. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but he also never charged another person excess admission. He became an advocate for venue safety, traveling to clubs across England to share his story. "The Beatles could have left me to die," he'd say. "I deserved it. But John Lennon came back for me. If the Beatles could forgive me, I had to forgive myself and do better." The rebuilt Cavern Club became a shrine to the Beatles, but also a reminder of what they really were. Not just musicians, but four lads from Liverpool, who, when faced with death, chose to be heroes. The new club had multiple exits, reinforced ceilings, and strict capacity limits. The Beatles played there again on August 3, 1963, their final Cavern performance, to a sold-out but safely limited crowd. What nobody knew until now. In 1970, after the Beatles had broken up, John Lennon returned to Liverpool alone. He went to Matthew Street and stood outside the rebuilt Cavern Club. It was closed, a Wednesday afternoon, but the owner recognized him and let him in. John went down those familiar steps, stood on the new stage, and played one song on an old guitar the club kept for emergencies. The song was "That'll Be the Day," the same song Paul had played in the tunnel while John was trapped. The owner, who witnessed this private performance, said John cried through the entire song. When he finished, John said, "This is where we became the Beatles, not in Hamburg, not at Abbey Road. Here, the night we chose people over music, that's when we became real." In 1980, just weeks before his death, John gave his final interview about the cavern collapse. People think the Beatles were about the music, and yeah, the music mattered. But that night at the cavern, we learned something. We learned that the music means nothing if you're not willing to put it aside to save a life. Every song we recorded after that, every album, every concert, it all carried a piece of that night. The night we almost died, the night we chose to live, the night we learned what really mattered. The final truth that nobody ever talks about. George Harrison, in a 1999 interview, just 2 years before his death from cancer, revealed one last detail about that night. In the tunnel, while they were rescuing Sarah and Tommy, George had found something carved into the tunnel wall. It was old, probably from the 1800s, but still readable. "Music lives forever." George took it as a sign, a message from the past to 4 young musicians crawling through sewage to save lives. "We could have died that night," George said. "All of us. The Beatles would have been a footnote, a local Liverpool band that died tragically before making it big. But we lived. And I think we lived because we were meant to prove those words true. Music does live forever, but only if the musicians remember they're human first." Paul McCartney still owns the piece of the collapsed cavern ceiling that nearly killed them. He keeps it in his home studio, a chunk of limestone with their blood still visible on it. "It reminds me," he said, "that every time we perform, we owe it to those people who were in the cavern that night. They trusted us with their lives. The least we can do is give them our best." Ringo Starr, who wasn't even officially in the band yet, became a full member 3 months later. When asked why the Beatles chose him over other drummers, John's answer was simple. "He crawled through a sewer to save lives with us. After that, everything else is easy." The Cavern Club collapse of February 9, 1961, never made international headlines. It was reported locally as a building failure with miraculous 0 fatalities. The Beatles' role was mentioned but not emphasized. They were still nobodies then, just another local band. But everyone who was there knew the truth. 300 people owed their lives to 4 musicians who chose humanity over ambition. Years later, at the height of Beatlemania, when the Beatles were the most famous people on earth, a reporter asked John about heroism. John laughed his famous cynical laugh and said, "Heroes? We're not heroes. We're just 4 lads who learned early that fame means nothing if you lose your soul getting it. The cavern taught us that. Nearly dying teaches you what living really means." But perhaps the most poignant epilogue came from Sarah Blackwood. In 2015, at age 71, she finally published her memoir about that night. The title was simple, Under the Stage. In it she wrote, "John Lennon saved my life twice that night. Once when he pushed me from the falling ceiling, and once when he showed me that even in absolute darkness, under a collapsed stage with death all around, a person can still choose kindness. He held me and told me to think about my art. In the worst moment of our lives, he made me remember beauty still existed." The memoir included her original sketch, now faded but still visible. John's face, captured in pen and ink moments before disaster, shows a young man on the edge of greatness. But Sarah added one detail after that night. In the corner of the sketch, barely visible, she wrote, "Hero." The Cavern Club still stands today, rebuilt but carrying the ghost of that night. Sometimes, late at night when the club is empty, staff say they can hear it, the sound of Paul's bass playing "That'll Be the Day," echoing from the walls, a reminder of the night the Beatles became more than a band. They became proof that sometimes, in the face of death, humans can be magnificent. That's the story mainstream history won't tell you. Four young men, not yet famous, not yet the Beatles as the world would know them, faced with a choice: save themselves or save everyone. They chose everyone. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the universe chose them to change the world. Because they'd already proven they deserved to. The music continues. The legend grows. But that night in the cavern remains the truest test the Beatles ever faced. And they passed it by forgetting about being the Beatles and remembering to be John, Paul, George, and Ringo, four lads from Liverpool, who, when the ceiling was literally falling, chose to stand tall.